The cantina on Kepler 7 space station was always busy. Aliens from dozens of worlds came here to drink, trade stories, and forget their troubles. The air was thick with smoke from different types of burning herbs that helped various species relax. Strange music played softly in the background, mixing sounds that no single species could fully appreciate. In the far corner, away from the main crowd, sat an old Altarian named Veltar Cross. His 4 arms were covered in scars, and his dark green skin showed the marks of many battles. His compound eyes, each the size of a human fist, watched everything in the room. He had been coming to this cantina for 3 years now, always sitting at the same table, always drinking the same strong Rigelian ale. Tonight was different, though. Word had spread through the station like wildfire. Humanity had been accepted into the Galactic Coalition. The news had everyone talking. Some were curious, others were worried, but most were just confused. Humans were new to space travel. Their technology was basic compared to most Coalition species. Why would the Coalition want them? At a table near the center of the cantina, 5 young alien cadets were laughing loudly. They wore the crisp uniforms of the Coalition Military Academy. Their voices carried across the room as they joked about the newest members of their alliance. Humans, laughed a young Zentari cadet, his blue skin glowing with amusement. Have you seen them? They only have 2 arms and 2 legs. How do they even fight? A Catherian female cadet giggled, her silver hair shimmering. I heard they come from a world with only 1 sun. How soft must they be? We Catherians need 3 suns just to feel comfortable. My instructor showed us images of their home world, added a Drakmori cadet, his red scales shifting color with his emotions. It is mostly water. They cannot even live on most of their own planet. How could they possibly help defend the galaxy? The other cadets nodded and continued drinking. They had all grown up hearing stories of great warrior races, the Altarians with their 4 arms and natural armor, the Zentari with their ability to phase through solid matter, the Catherians with their telepathic battle coordination. What could humans possibly offer? I bet they will run at the first sign of real danger, said another cadet. Soft species always do. Veltar had been listening to this conversation for the past hour. Each joke made his grip tighten on his drink. Each laugh brought back memories he tried hard to forget. Finally, he could not take it anymore. The old veteran stood up slowly, his 4 arms moving with the careful precision of someone who had seen too much combat. The cantina grew quieter as Veltar walked across the room. He was not particularly tall, but there was something about the way he moved that made others step aside. His heavy boots clicked against the metal floor with each step. When he reached the cadets' table, he looked down at them with all the authority of his years of service. You think humans are weak, he said. His voice was rough like rocks grinding together. The translator device on his neck turned his words into the common galactic language, but it could not hide the emotion behind them. The cadets looked up, suddenly uncomfortable. They recognized the uniform Veltar wore under his civilian clothes. He was a Coalition veteran, and by the number of service medals on his chest, he had seen serious action. Sir, we were just... the Zentari cadet began. You were just showing how little you know about war. Veltar interrupted. He pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. I have fought in 17 different conflicts across 4 galactic sectors. I have served with warriors who could tear through steel with their bare claws. I have seen tactical minds that could calculate battle outcomes faster than most computers. He paused and took a long drink from his bottle. The cadets waited, not sure if they should leave or stay. But nothing, Veltar continued, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I saw when humanity entered the Xerion conflict. The blue-skinned Zentari cadet laughed nervously. Sir, with respect, humans have barely left their home system. What could they possibly— Shut up, Veltar said quietly. The words carried such weight that the entire cantina seemed to grow quieter. You want to know about humans? You want to understand why the Coalition accepted them? Then listen. Listen and learn why I have not slept well in 3 years. The old Altarian veteran looked around the table at each young face. They were so confident, so sure of their place in the galaxy. They reminded him of himself before the Xerion conflict. Before he learned what humans were really capable of. The Xerion system was supposed to be an easy assignment, Veltar began. The Davak Empire was pushing into Coalition space, but it was just 1 fleet. Standard procedure was to send a mixed task force, show some strength, and negotiate a peace treaty. Simple military diplomacy. He took another drink, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's dim lights. I was serving as a tactical advisor to Admiral Thexnul, good commander, fought in 12 successful campaigns. We had ships from 6 different coalition species. The Zentari provided phase shift fighters. The Kitherians brought their telepathic coordination networks. The Drakmori had their heavy assault vessels. We thought we were ready for anything. The cadets leaned forward despite themselves. Veltar's voice had taken on the tone of someone telling a story that had been told many times, but never got easier to share. Then the human fleet arrived, he said. 3 ships. Just 3. Compared to our force of 47 vessels, they seemed like nothing. Their ships were smaller, their weapons were basic projectile systems, and their crew numbers were tiny. Admiral Thexnel almost sent them home. Why didn't he? Asked the Kitherian cadet quietly. Veltar's 4 hands gripped his drink tighter. Because their commander, a human named Lee Taemin, asked for just one thing. He wanted to study our enemy for 24 hours before we engaged. He said humans like to understand their opponents before fighting them. The old veteran looked around the cantina, noting how many other patrons had stopped their own conversations to listen. Stories of the Xerian conflict were rare. Most survivors did not like to talk about it. We laughed, Veltar admitted. 24 hours to study an enemy we had been fighting for months? What could they possibly learn that we did not already know? But Admiral Thexnel was curious about these new coalition members, so he agreed. He finished his drink and signaled for another. The young cadets waited, caught up in the story despite their earlier confidence. That was our first mistake, Veltar said as a server brought him a fresh bottle, giving humans time to think. Because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about warfare. The cantina had grown almost silent now. Even the background music seemed quieter. Veltar looked at each cadet again, seeing his younger self in their eager faces. You think war is about honor? He told them. You think it is about superior technology or better training or tactical brilliance. Before Xerion, I thought the same thing. But humans taught me something different. They taught me that war is about one thing and one thing only. What? Whispered the Drakmori cadet. Veltar's compound eyes seemed to focus on something far away, something that still haunted his dreams. Survival, he said. And humans are very, very good at surviving. Veltar took a long drink from his fresh bottle and settled back in his chair. The young cadets around the table had stopped laughing. Even the other patrons in the cantina had moved closer, drawn by the promise of a war story from a real veteran. The Xerion system had been under attack for 6 months when we arrived, Veltar continued. The Divac Empire wanted the mining colonies on Xerion Prime, rich deposits of quantum crystals, perfect for powering their war machines. The planet had about 2 million coalition civilians, mostly miners and their families. He paused, remembering the briefing files he had read so many years ago. The Divacs were not subtle about their invasion. They sent massive fleets, heavy assault troops, the works, standard imperial conquest tactics, take the planet, enslave the population, strip the resources. They had done it dozens of times before on other worlds. The Zentari cadet shifted uncomfortably. But surely the coalition defense forces were ready for them. Veltar's forearms moved in what might have been a shrug. The local defense fleet fought well. They held the Divacs off for 4 months before calling for help. But by the time we arrived, things were bad. The enemy had landed ground forces on 3 continents. Our people were trapped in the underground mining complexes, hiding from orbital bombardment. He took another drink, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's lights. Admiral Thexnul called a strategy meeting as soon as we arrived in system. All the senior commanders gathered on his flagship. I was there as tactical advisor, along with representatives from each species in our task force, standard military protocol. Veltar's voice took on a bitter tone. We spent 6 hours planning our attack. Orbital formations, fighter escort patterns, ground assault coordination. Everything by the book, just like we had been trained. The Kitherian telepaths would coordinate our movements. The Zentari phase fighters would hit their supply lines. The Drakmori heavy ships would engage their main fleet. He looked around the table at the young faces watching him. Then Commander Lee Taemin spoke up. This human, barely half the size of Admiral Thexnul, raised his hand like a cadet asking a question. He said he had spent his 24 hours studying the Divac forces and he had some suggestions. The Catherian cadet leaned forward. What kind of suggestions? The kind that should have gotten him thrown out of the meeting, Veltar replied. He started talking about things that were not in any military manual. Using civilian ships as weapons, turning the planet's own asteroid belt against the enemy, fighting in ways that broke every rule of honorable combat. Veltar's voice grew quieter, forcing his listeners to strain to hear him. Admiral Thexnol was furious. He told Li Taemin that the coalition military fought with honor, not with tricks and deception. But the human just stood there, calm as deep space, and said something I will never forget. The old veteran looked directly at each cadet. He said, "Admiral, with respect, honor will not save those 2 million civilians, but maybe dishonor will." The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background music had stopped. That was when I knew humans were different, Veltar continued. Every other species in that room was thinking about military glory, about winning a clean victory that would look good in the history books. But Li Taemin was only thinking about keeping people alive. He took a long drink before continuing. The meeting broke up with no agreement. Admiral Thexnol ordered the humans to stay in reserve while our main forces engaged the enemy. Li Taemin just nodded and said his ships would be ready when needed. He did not argue, did not protest. He just accepted the orders. Veltar's 4 hands tightened around his bottle. The next morning we attacked. 44 coalition ships against 67 Divak vessels. The numbers were not terrible, but the enemy had better positioning. They were dug in around the planet with defensive platforms and fighter screens. The old veteran's voice became mechanical, as if he was reading from an old report. The battle lasted 8 hours. We followed standard tactical doctrine. Coordinated. Assault patterns, honor guard formations, proper engagement ranges. The Catherians linked their minds to coordinate our movements. The Zentari fighters phased through enemy defenses. The Drakmori heavies traded volleys with their battleships. He paused, his compound eyes focusing on something beyond the cantina walls. We were losing. Not badly, but steadily. The Divaks had more ships and better defensive positions. Our casualties were mounting, and we had barely scratched their main fleet. Admiral Thexnol was preparing to call for reinforcements when everything changed. "What happened?" asked the Drakmori cadet, his scales shifting to dark red with anticipation. "The humans happened," Veltar said simply. "While we were fighting our honorable battle in space, the 3 human ships had disappeared. Gone completely dark, no communications, no sensor readings. Admiral Thexnol thought they had run away. He took another drink and his voice became harder. Then the Divak supply convoy exploded. 12 transport ships carrying ammunition and fuel for their ground forces just gone, torn apart by what looked like asteroid impacts." The Divak commander started screaming about coalition treachery, about using space debris as weapons. The Zentari cadet looked confused. But asteroids do not just attack ships. Someone had to guide them. Someone did, Veltar agreed. The humans had spent those 24 hours mapping every piece of rock in the asteroid belt. They had calculated orbital mechanics, trajectory patterns, gravitational effects. Then they used tiny explosive charges to nudge asteroids into collision courses with the enemy supply ships. He looked around the table at the shocked faces, but that was just the beginning. While the Divaks were dealing with their supply problems, civilian freighters started exploding throughout the system. Cargo ships, passenger vessels, even old mining barges, all of them heading straight for Divak positions at ramming speed. The Catherian cadet gasped. The humans were using civilians as weapons? No, Veltar said firmly. The ships were empty. The humans had evacuated every civilian they could find and loaded their empty ships with whatever explosives they could jury-rig. Old mining charges, fuel cells, even kitchen chemicals. Nothing sophisticated. Just things that would make a big explosion when a ship hit something at high speed. His voice took on an almost awed tone. Commander Li Taemin had spent his study time learning everything about the Zerion system. Not just the enemy positions, but the civilian infrastructure, the asteroid patterns, the shipping lanes, even the waste disposal routes. He turned the entire system into a weapon. Veltar finished his second bottle and signaled for a third. The Divak fleet was in chaos. They were being attacked by rocks and garbage. Their supply lines were cut. Their formations were broken as ships tried to avoid collisions with seemingly random debris. And through it all, 3 small human ships darted around the system like insects, too small and fast for the big DVAC guns to target effectively. The old veteran's compound eyes seemed to glow in the cantina's dim light. That was when I realized what Lee Taman had been doing during his 24 hours of study. He had not been learning about the enemy. He had been learning about the battlefield. And then he had turned that knowledge into a strategy that no military academy in the galaxy would ever teach. He looked directly at the young cadets. We won that battle, not through superior firepower or better training or telepathic coordination. We won because 3 humans had spent one day thinking about how to use everything in the system as a weapon, including things that were never meant to be weapons. The Drakmori cadets' scales had shifted to a pale orange. That is not how wars are supposed to be fought. Veltar's laugh was bitter. That is exactly what Admiral Thexnell said, right before he recommended the humans for commendation and asked them to help plan our ground assault strategy. He took a drink from his 3rd bottle. Because while we were celebrating our space victory, we still had a bigger problem. The Devacs had 200,000 troops on the planet's surface, and they were using the civilian population as shields. Standard military doctrine said we would need to lay siege for months, maybe years. Veltar's voice dropped to a whisper. Lee Taman said he could get our people out in 2 weeks. All he needed was a small team of volunteers and permission to ignore every rule of civilized warfare. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of Veltar's breathing seemed loud. That was when I volunteered to go down to the planet with them, he said. I thought I understood what humans were capable of after watching them fight in space. I thought I was ready for anything. He looked around the table at the 5 young faces staring at him. I was wrong. Veltar stared into his drink for a long moment before continuing. The cantina had grown so quiet that the sound of air recyclers seemed loud. Other patrons had abandoned their own conversations to listen to the old veteran's story. The planet's surface was a nightmare, he began. Zirion Prime's main city had been beautiful once. Clean streets, tall buildings, parks where families could enjoy the artificial atmosphere. When I landed with the human team, it looked like a war zone from the old histories. He took a small sip from his bottle, his 4 hands trembling slightly. The Devacs had turned the city into a fortress. They had barricades on every street, snipers in every tall building, and patrol groups moving through the ruins constantly. Worse, they were using the civilian population as living shields. Every Devac position had coalition citizens around it, mostly women and children from the mining families. The young Zentari cadet shifted uncomfortably. Standard hostage tactics. Despicable but not unusual for the Devac Empire. True, Veltar agreed. What was unusual was the human response to it. Any normal military force would have been paralyzed. You cannot attack enemies who are surrounded by innocent people. It goes against every law of civilized warfare. He looked around the table at the eager young faces. The human team was led by Captain Park Sojin, small female. Probably weighed less than one of my arms, but she had eyes like a hunting predator. She brought 12 other humans with her. Each one was a specialist in something, but none of them seemed to specialize in normal military tactics. Veltar's voice took on an almost admiring tone. There was Sergeant Moon Ji-sung, their demolitions expert. But instead of just knowing how to blow things up, he understood buildings, how they were constructed, where the weak points were, how to make them fall in specific directions. He could look at a structure and see 20 different ways to destroy it. The old veteran paused to take another drink. Then there was Corporal Shin Da-un, their sniper. I had worked with snipers from 7 different species, but nothing like her. She could remain completely motionless for 18 hours at a time. No food, no water, no communication, just waiting for the perfect shot that might never come. The Catherian cadet looked puzzled. 18 hours? That is longer than most species can stay conscious. Humans are persistence hunters, Veltar explained. On their homeworld, they evolved to chase prey for days without stopping. 18 hours of waiting is nothing to them. But it gets worse. Shin-Da-un was not just patient. She was invisible. He set down his bottle and used his 4 hands to gesture. I watched her set up a position on the 3rd day of our mission. She found a bombed-out apartment building, climbed to the 15th floor, and arranged herself among the rubble. She used debris to break up her outline, painted her face with dust and ash, even controlled her breathing to match the wind patterns. Veltar's compound eyes focused on the memory. 6 hours later, a Divac patrol entered that same building. 12 soldiers, fully armed, searching every room for coalition infiltrators. They walked past her position 3 times. One soldier stood less than 2 meters away from her for 5 minutes talking on his radio. She never moved, never blinked, never even seemed to breathe. The Drakmori cadet's scales had shifted to a pale green. How is that possible? Training, Veltar said simply. Humans train for situations that would kill most other species. But that was not the most disturbing part about their team. He took a longer drink before continuing. The most disturbing part was Nam Ho Seok, their communications specialist. This human could speak 7 different alien languages fluently. Not just basic communication, but perfect dialect, regional accents, even cultural references. He sounded more like a native Divac than most actual Divacs. The old veteran's voice dropped to a whisper. On our second night, Nam Ho Seok intercepted a Divac radio transmission. Instead of just listening, he started talking back. He convinced the enemy commander that there was a spy in their ranks, someone feeding information to the coalition forces. Within 6 hours, the Divacs had arrested 12 of their own soldiers and were executing them for treason. The silence in the cantina was complete now. Even the air recyclers seemed to have stopped humming. That was when I realized what the humans were really doing. Veltar continued. They were not just fighting the enemy. They were making the enemy fight themselves. Every piece of false information, every intercepted message, every small act of sabotage was designed to create paranoia and confusion. He looked directly at each young cadet. Captain Park So-jin explained their strategy to me on the 3rd day. She said humans had learned long ago that the most effective way to defeat a superior enemy was to make them defeat themselves. Fear, confusion, and mistrust were better weapons than any gun or bomb. The Zentari cadet found his voice. But what about the civilians? How did they rescue the hostages? Veltar's forearms moved in a gesture that might have been respect or horror. That was the most frightening part of all. The humans did not see the hostage situation as a problem to solve. They saw it as a weapon to use against the enemy. He took another drink, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's lights like dark mirrors. On the 4th day, Sergeant Moon Ji-sung started his real work. He had been studying the city's infrastructure, learning how everything connected. The power grid, the water system, the communication networks, even the waste disposal tunnels. He found ways to move through the city that the Divacs had never considered. Veltar's voice became mechanical again, as if he was reading from a report. The humans started small. A power failure here, a water main break there, a communication tower that stopped working for no obvious reason. Each incident was minor, but they added up. The Divacs had to send repair teams to fix the problems, which meant fewer guards watching the hostages. The old veteran's voice grew harder. But the humans were not just causing random damage. Every breakdown was carefully planned to force the enemy to move in predictable patterns. When the power failed in Sector 7, the Divacs had to bring generators from Sector 12. When the water stopped flowing in the government district, they had to send engineers from the residential areas. He looked around the table at the shocked faces. Captain Park So-jin was using the city's own infrastructure to herd the enemy like cattle. She would break something in one place to force them to respond in another place, where Corporal Shin Da-yoon would be waiting with her rifle, or where Sergeant Moon Ji-sung had prepared a building to collapse at exactly the right moment. The Kitherian cadet's silver hair had stopped shimmering. They were turning the entire city into a trap. Exactly, Veltar confirmed. But the most disturbing part was how they dealt with the civilian hostages. Instead of trying to rescue them directly, the humans made it too dangerous for the Divacs to keep them. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Nam Ho Seok started broadcasting fake coalition radio messages that the Divacs could intercept. Messages about orbital bombardment targets, about which buildings were going to be destroyed, about civilian evacuation zones that did not actually exist. He made the enemy believe that keeping hostages would not protect them from coalition attacks. Veltar finished his 3rd bottle and did not signal for another. Within a week, the Divacs started moving the civilians away from their military positions. They thought they were protecting them from coalition bombardment, but they were actually making them easier to rescue. Small human teams would slip in during the confusion and guide groups of civilians to real evacuation points. The old veteran looked around the cantina, noting how many other patrons were listening to his story. By the end of the second week, the DVAC forces were scattered, paranoid, and isolated. They were fighting shadows and rumors instead of actual enemies. Their communication networks were compromised, their supply lines were cut, and they could not trust their own intelligence reports because Nam Hoseok was feeding them false information. He stood up slowly, his forearms moving with the careful precision of someone who had seen too much combat. That was when Captain Park So-jin told me the real plan. He said, everything we had done, all the sabotage and psychological warfare had been preparation for the final phase. The humans were not trying to defeat the DVAC ground forces. They were preparing to make them surrender. Veltar looked down at the young cadets, seeing his own younger self in their stunned expressions. I asked her how 12 humans could make 200,000 DVAC soldiers surrender. She smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I had ever seen on any face. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of distant ships docking seemed loud. She said, simple. We are going to show them what humans do when they stop playing by the rules. Veltar remained standing for a moment, his forearms hanging at his sides as he stared at something beyond the cantina walls. The young cadets watched him nervously, unsure if he would continue his story or simply walk away. Finally, he sat back down, but he did not order another drink. The final phase began on day 15, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I understood human warfare by then. I had seen their tricks, their psychological tactics, their ability to turn infrastructure into weapons. I thought I was prepared for whatever came next. He looked directly at the Zentari cadet. I was wrong. Everything the humans had done before was just preparation. What happened next showed me why their species survived on a death world, and why the Galaxy Council was right to fear them. The old veteran's compound eyes seemed to focus on memories that still haunted him. Captain Park So-jin gathered her team in an abandoned subway station beneath the city. 12 humans, plus me as the coalition observer. She spread out maps of the remaining DVAC positions, but these were not normal military maps. They showed things I had never seen marked before. Veltar's four hands moved as he described what he remembered. Geological stress points, underground gas lines, water table levels, structural load calculations for every major building, emergency shelter locations, even psychological pressure points based on DVAC military doctrine. It was like looking at a blueprint for destroying an entire civilization. The Ketherian cadet's silver hair had gone completely dull. What were they planning? Total warfare, Veltar replied. Not just defeating the enemy, but breaking their will to fight. Captain Park So-jin explained that humans had learned something important during their own planetary wars. The fastest way to end a conflict was to make the enemy believe that continuing to fight would result in complete annihilation. He paused, his breathing heavy. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. The humans would demonstrate 3 things to the DVAC commander. First, that nowhere was safe. Second, that surrender was the only path to survival. Third, that humans would sacrifice anything, including themselves, to achieve victory. Veltar's voice became mechanical again, as if reading from a report he wished he could forget. Phase 1 began at exactly midnight. Sergeant Moon Ji-sung had spent 2 weeks studying the city's support structures, not just buildings, but everything that held the city together. Power conduits, water mains, communication cables, even the underground transit system. The old veteran's forearms trembled slightly. He did not destroy anything important. Instead, he created what he called a cascade failure demonstration. He damaged exactly 17 minor support structures throughout the city. Each one was insignificant by itself, but together they created a chain reaction. The Drakmori cadet leaned forward. What kind of chain reaction? At 12:47 a.m., a 6-block section of the government district simply collapsed, Veltar said. Not from explosions or bombardment, but from structural failure. The buildings just fell down one after another, like a line of dominoes. 40,000 tons of concrete and steel turned into rubble in less than 10 minutes. He took a shaky breath. The DVAC forces in that area had 30 seconds of warning, enough time to realize what was happening, but not enough time to escape. 3,000 enemy soldiers died in a disaster that looked completely natural. No coalition weapons detected. No attack patterns visible, just buildings falling down because their support had been carefully removed. The cantina had grown cold, despite the environmental controls. Other patrons had stopped pretending to mind their own business and were openly listening to the story. But that was just the demonstration, Veltar continued. Captain Park Sojin used the confusion to broadcast a message on all Divak military frequencies. Nam Hoseok had learned to mimic the voice patterns of their Supreme Commander perfectly. The old veteran's voice took on a mocking tone as he repeated the message. This is what happens when you fight humans. Your strongest positions become death traps. Your safest shelters become your tombs. We can bring down your buildings with a few cuts in the right places. What else can we bring down? He looked around the table at the horrified young faces. Phase 2 began immediately. The humans had identified every critical piece of infrastructure that the Divaks depended on. Not just military equipment, but everything they needed to survive. Food distribution, medical supplies, waste processing, even oxygen recycling in the underground bunkers. Veltar's compound eyes reflected the cantina lights like dark mirrors. But instead of destroying these systems, the humans did something worse. They took control of them. Nam Hoseok had been intercepting Divak communications for 2 weeks, learning their security codes and command protocols. Suddenly, enemy soldiers found their own equipment turning against them. The Zentari cadets' blue skin had gone pale. How is that possible? Human ingenuity, Veltar said bitterly. They had studied Divak technology during the space battle, learning how their systems worked. Then they used that knowledge to hack into everything. Food dispensers that delivered spoiled rations, medical equipment that gave false readings, environmental controls that flooded bunkers with harmless but terrifying gases. He paused, his 4 hands gripping the edge of the table. The Divaks started to realize that their own technology could not be trusted. Every system they depended on might turn against them without warning. But that was still not the worst part. The old veteran looked directly at each cadet. Phase 3 was psychological. The humans had been studying Divak military doctrine, learning what their warriors feared most. For Divaks, the greatest dishonor was dying without purpose, being killed by an enemy they could not even see or understand. Veltar's voice dropped to a whisper. Corporal Shinda-un began what she called demonstration eliminations. Every day, at exactly noon, she would kill one high-ranking Divak officer with a single shot from an impossible distance. Not just any officers, but specific ones chosen for maximum psychological impact. The Catherian cadet gasped. That is assassination, not warfare. The humans called it leadership degradation, Veltar replied. Each target was chosen carefully. First, the officer who had ordered the execution of coalition civilians, then the commander who had refused to allow medical aid to wounded prisoners, then the intelligence chief who had been torturing captured miners for information. His voice became harder, but here is what made it truly terrifying. After each kill, Nam Hoseok would broadcast the reason for the execution on all Divak frequencies. He would list the target's crimes against coalition civilians, explain exactly how they had been killed, and promise that more justice would follow. The old veteran stood up again, his movement slow and careful. The Divak soldiers started to understand that they were not fighting a normal enemy. They were fighting something that knew their individual crimes, could reach them anywhere, and would never stop hunting them. Every leader who had committed atrocities found himself looking over his shoulder, waiting for a bullet that might come from any direction. Veltar walked to the cantina's large viewing window and stared out at the stars. By day 20, the Divak forces were in complete chaos. Their buildings were collapsing, their equipment was unreliable, and their leaders were being picked off one by an invisible sniper. But Captain Park Sojin saved the worst for last. He turned back to face the young cadets. Phase 4 was what she called total commitment demonstration. The humans were going to show the enemy what their species would do rather than accept defeat. The cantina was completely silent now. Even the background system seemed to have stopped humming. The remaining Divak forces had retreated to their strongest position, a fortified complex in the city center. Massive bunkers overlapping defensive fields, enough supplies for a year-long siege. It should have been impregnable. Veltar's forearms moved in a gesture that might have been despair or admiration. Captain Park Sojin looked at that fortress and saw something different. She saw a target that was too strong to attack from the outside. but perfect for destruction from within. So she decided to get inside. The Drakmori cadet's scales had shifted to almost white. How? She walked up to the front gate and surrendered, Veltar said simply. All 12 humans fully armed, broadcasting their positions on open frequencies. They told the Devak commander that they were tired of fighting and wanted to negotiate terms. The old veteran's voice became filled with something like awe. Of course, it was a lie. The humans had no intention of surrendering. But they knew that the Devak commander would want to interrogate them, to learn coalition secrets and use them as propaganda tools. So they allowed themselves to be captured and brought inside the fortress. He looked around the table at the stunned young faces. What happened next is why I have nightmares, because I realize that humans do not just fight to win, they fight to ensure that anyone who threatens them will never be able to threaten anyone again. Veltar returned to his seat, but his forearms continued to shake. The young cadets watched him with wide eyes, afraid to break the silence that had fallen over the cantina. Other patrons had abandoned any pretense of their own conversations and were openly staring at the old veteran. I was monitoring coalition frequencies. When the humans allowed themselves to be captured, he began. Captain Park So-jin had given me specific instructions. If I did not hear from her team within 6 hours, I was to contact Admiral Thexnell and request immediate orbital bombardment of the Devak fortress. He looked directly at the Zentari cadet. She was planning to sacrifice herself and her entire team to eliminate the enemy command structure. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was that she told me this plan like she was discussing the weather. 12 humans were prepared to die just to make sure their enemies could never hurt anyone again. The old veteran's compound eyes focused on memories that still haunted him. But humans, as I learned, do not give up easily. Even when captured, even when outnumbered 50-1, even when locked in the most secure facility the Devaks could build, they kept fighting. Veltar's voice took on an almost awed tone. 3 hours after their capture, I started receiving coded transmissions from inside the fortress. Short bursts of data hidden in what looked like random electromagnetic interference. Nam Hoseok had built a communication device from spare parts in his equipment kit. Pieces so small that the Devaks had not thought to confiscate them during the search. The Catherian cadet leaned forward. What were the messages saying? Intelligence reports, Veltar replied. Fortress layout, guard rotations, weapon positions, everything we would need for a rescue operation. But then the messages changed. Instead of asking for rescue, Captain Park So-jin started sending instructions. He paused, his forehands gripping the table edge. She had discovered something inside the fortress. The Devak commander was not just a military leader. He was a war criminal who had been using Zerion Prime as a testing ground for new weapons, biological agents, mind control experiments, torture techniques that violated every galactic treaty. The old veteran's voice became harder. But more importantly, she learned that this was not just an invasion. It was a preparation phase. The Devaks were planning to use Zerion Prime as a base for attacks on 12 other coalition worlds. 200 billion civilians were going to die if this operation succeeded. Veltar stood up and walked back to the viewing window. That changed everything for the humans. This was no longer about defending one planet or saving 2 million people. This was about preventing a genocide that would dwarf anything in galactic history. He turned back to face the young cadets. Captain Park So-jin sent one final message. 4 words that I will never forget. Implementing total war protocol. Then all communication stopped. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of distant ships seemed loud. What happened next took place over 17 hours, Veltar continued. I monitored everything from orbit, but I could only piece together the full story later from security recordings and survivor testimony. His voice became mechanical, as if reading from a report. The humans had been separated and placed in different cells throughout the fortress. Standard interrogation procedure, designed to prevent coordinated escape attempts. But humans, as I learned, can coordinate without speaking to each other. The Drakmori cadets' scales had gone completely white. How is that possible? They had planned for capture, Veltar explained. Each team member knew exactly what the others would do in any situation. Sergeant Moon Ji-sung would target the structural supports. Corporal Shin Da-eun would eliminate key personnel. Nam Hoseok would take control of communications. Captain Park So-jin would locate and secure the intelligence data. The old veteran's compound eyes reflected the viewing window's starlight. But they also did something that no other species would ever consider. They turned their own capture into a weapon. Every human carried hidden devices, not just communication equipment, but things designed to cause maximum damage if activated. He looked around the table at the horrified young faces. Sergeant Moon Ji-sung had been carrying micro-explosives disguised as medical implants, not enough to kill him, but enough to bring down support beams if placed correctly. Corporal Shin Da-yoon had poison capsules that could contaminate the fortress water supply. Nam Ho-seok had computer viruses programmed into his neural implants. Veltar's voice dropped to a whisper. They had turned themselves into walking weapons, prepared to sacrifice their own lives to eliminate the enemy. But that still was not the most terrifying part. The silence in the cantina was complete now. Even the air recyclers seemed to have stopped humming. The most terrifying part was what Captain Park So-jin discovered in the DVAC commander's private files. Detailed plans for biological weapons that would target specific genetic markers. The DVACs were planning to create diseases that would kill only coalition species, leaving their own people immune. The old veteran's forearms moved in a gesture of despair. When the humans learned this, something changed in them. I could hear it in Captain Park So-jin's voice during her final transmission. She was no longer fighting to defend Zerion Prime. She was fighting to save every living being in Coalition space. Veltar walked back to his seat but remained standing. What happened next lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. The humans implemented what they called Scorched Earth Protocol, not just destroying the enemy, but making sure that their plans, their research, and their capabilities could never be recovered or rebuilt. His voice became filled with something like awe. They turned the fortress into a death trap. Every system, every weapon, every piece of equipment was converted into a tool for destruction. The DVACs found themselves trapped in their own stronghold while it collapsed around them. The Zentari cadet found his voice. But how did 12 captured prisoners destroy an entire fortress? By using the enemy's strengths against them, Veltar replied. The fortress was designed to be impregnable from outside attack, but it was not designed to withstand coordinated sabotage from within. The humans exploited every weakness, turned every safety system into a weapon, and used the facility's own power sources to fuel its destruction. He finally sat down, his 4 arms hanging limp at his sides. When the fortress finally fell, there were no survivors on either side. 12 humans had eliminated 40,000 DVAC soldiers, including their entire command structure, and all records of their biological weapons research. The threat to 200 billion coalition civilians was ended. The old veteran looked around the table at the young faces staring at him. That was 3 years ago. The Zerion conflict officially ended with complete coalition victory. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Coalition and invited to contribute to our mutual defense efforts. Tar's compound eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the cantina walls, but I learned something during that conflict that keeps me awake at night. We always assumed that the most dangerous species in the galaxy were the ones with superior technology, or greater physical strength, or advanced mental abilities. He looked directly at each cadet. We were wrong. The most dangerous species is the one that refuses to accept defeat, no matter the cost. Humans do not just fight to win. They fight to ensure that anyone who threatens them, or their allies, will never be able to threaten anyone again. The old veteran stood up and placed payment for his drinks on the table. You want to know why the coalition accepted humanity? He asked. It is simple. We realized that we had a choice. We could have them as allies or we could face them as enemies. And after seeing what 12 humans could do when they stopped playing by the rules, we knew which choice to make. As Veltar walked toward the cantina exit, one of the young cadets called after him. Sir, you said this keeps you awake at night, but surely having humans as allies should make you feel safer. Veltar stopped and turned back, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina lights one final time. That is exactly why I cannot sleep, he said, because I know that somewhere in coalition space, there are humans training for the next war. Learning about new enemies, studying new weaknesses, preparing new tactics that no military academy would ever teach. He looked around the cantina one last time. The humans have a saying, peace through superior firepower. But what they do not tell you is that they consider themselves the firepower. And knowing that they are on our side is both the most comforting and the most terrifying thought in the galaxy. With that, The old Altarian veteran walked out of the cantina, leaving behind a room full of silent aliens who would never think about humanity the same way again. The young cadets sat in stunned silence for several minutes before quietly paying their bills and leaving. None of them spoke about what they had heard, but all of them would remember the story for the rest of their lives. And somewhere in Coalition space, human military advisors continued their work, preparing for threats that had not yet emerged, and ensuring that the galaxy's newest members would never again face extinction alone.